You're listening to The Outcue, a 21 News journalist perspective on a top news story.
Good morning. It is Thursday, May 1st, and this is The Outcue. I'm Assistant News Director Justin Mitchell. Last week, Goshen Township dog breeder April Wademan was sentenced to house arrest, probation, and fines after taking money from hundreds of people for puppies that were never delivered. It's a story that we followed from the beginning, and it all happened because of a crucial element in journalism, which is trust. So that's the topic that we're exploring today, is trust in journalism, trust among journalists and sources, and of course, trust between journalists and the audience, you. So with me today to talk about that story, as well as trust in general, are Corey McCrae, who covered that story at the very beginning, and Robert McFerren. So Robert, I'm going to start with you. Tell us about the Wademan story and how it originally came to your attention and the role that building trust played in following it as closely as we did.
It was a post I came across on social media. It was a group that was created, and I just happened to be scrolling through, and there was a bunch of people complaining, as people do on Facebook. You're kind of scrolling, and I see this group talking about something like, what's going on here? What are they talking about? So I started, and I saw they were saying that they had paid for puppies, never received a puppy, but they couldn't get anyone to listen. They were pleading for someone to do something. They were saying, these were purebred dogs. They're not cheap. And they were saying there's a lot of people that were promised dogs that were not. And so they were trying to find out who all had had the same experience. So it was, and so I reached out to them through Facebook and said, hey, who I was and what I'm looking at and what's going on here. And they got back to me and explained, the situation and how they just couldn't get anyone to help them. And they were pleading for someone to listen to what was going on, saying that they thought this was bigger than just one person getting screwed of money.
Now, at that point, because I don't remember, had any court action been filed at all yet?
No, there had been police reports filed, because I'd reached out to the chief of police at Goshen and asked him, hey, I'm hearing about this. Do you have any police reports? And he was kind of like, yeah, you're going to want to give me some time to print these out. I'm like, no. Why? He's like, we have a few, and I went over and it was a stack of papers.
Right. And so now, Corey, you've been in the courtroom for this case. You've spoken to several of these victims. What's your approach to getting somebody to open up to you in a moment like that? Obviously, somebody who's been taken advantage of, they're angry, but I'm sure there's a certain level of embarrassment. It's not something that they necessarily want to come, public with. So how do you break through that?
I think in a situation like this, you talk to anybody, and something that'll make you more mad than anything is being scammed. And like you said, it's pretty isolating because people are embarrassed to come forward and say, like, I got scammed out of it. People say, oh, I didn't do my research, or I did something wrong, when there's just people out, there's just people who do this kind of thing, who will scam in cases. And and I remember talking to a woman named Barbara and another girl named Cassandra, and when you're talking about buying dogs, in this case, like puppies, they're not cheap. You're talking $800, $1,600. People just don't have that kind of money to throw away to commit. People are making, like, they're getting emotionally invested in adding a family member to their home, and then on top of that, there's the financial impact of that.
And you saw people that were also saying, like, this was a support dog. They had lost a loved one, and I was buying this dog for my grieving period. And so there was a lot of that type of human element to this.
Of course, and people, they're frustrated, but in talking to them, you want them to understand, like, hey, like, I'm a listening ear here first. It's just, a lot of times I don't even approach them with the camera. I'm just talking to them as if, being that person. Because sometimes you might be the first person they're venting to, because like you said, people were asking for help, they were getting frustrated, nobody was listening, and, we were the first ones there, to kind of open up and say, hey, what's going on? And sometimes people feel like nothing will change, so then they don't say anything. Yeah. And it's so hard to, and we've seen it, people getting, people, they'll have an issue with something, and then they're like, well, somebody else, ought to do it, or somebody better do it. And, I think we do a halfway decent job of trying to get people say, hey, like, it's uncomfortable to get on camera and maybe be the person who's in front of all this. But like, this is where the change starts, because, an interview with somebody like that who's talking about, and not just, losing the money, but the impact that it's had on them, the different stories, people who've lost loved ones, and now that's the replacement aspect of it. So there's like so much, to dive into. And then I think, a prosecutor sees that, right? Because it started in Sebring Court. Judge Joe Schiavone was listening to a bunch of civil cases, right? Just a bunch of civil cases, people coming up and just, explaining what their case was. And I think the work that we do, not only do we have relationships with these people, some of them that continue after this, like we're humans, we're ultimately humans. But then there's the aspect of, okay, now it's like we push this further down the line. We see action being taken a lot quicker, with that pressure being put on.
Because several individuals became more of a monolith of people with similar stories. Right. Now, and also, I think it probably helps that we've done some vetting at that point, because remember, I mean, trust goes both ways. People saying they got scammed doesn't mean they did get scammed. Right. We need to do our due diligence. Yep. Robert, you took a call from April Wademan herself while you began looking into this, and certainly she was going to get a fair shake. I mean, to talk about that call.
Yeah, because she called me because I went into this group and I put my cell number in there and said, I'd like to talk with anyone who wants to talk with us. And she was one of the first calls I got. And said, she told me that she wanted her attorney to, I was like, I would love to talk to the attorney because, again, I want everybody's side on this. This is not a one-sided story. I want to be fair to everyone here. I don't know what's happening. Maybe something happened that she couldn't provide the puppy. So let's hear that side of the story. And it was just one of those that she, talked with me for a while. I offered her a chance to talk on camera. She declined. She offered to talk with her attorney, and then we didn't get the attorney either. But so we did reach out to them multiple times and tried to get their side of the story, but we never did get it for air.
And I recall that at a certain point, I know my perception of her was very, is this somebody who got in over their head? Yeah. Is there a level of sympathy for her? And there may be. I think that there are legitimate problems that she was facing and did get in over her head. Where it started to become clear where the credibility gap was when new reports kept getting filed and more victims kept coming forward, and the dates were past the point where she had called, and the original sort of excuses, for lack of a better word, she was continuing to do this even after she was in over her head.
And then the people became comfortable with us and were sending us like text threads of that, here's my conversation that I had, that was showing a pattern as well, that people were, unhappy, and sometimes the responses were not, sorry for what happened. It was, stuff happens.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so building that thread, because you mentioned them reaching out to us with those text threads, they also were keeping us abreast of every development in court. Obviously, we can follow that on a docket. We can make sure we're at every hearing. But, there's a lot of times where what you run into is, okay, there was a scheduling discussion and the attorneys say they can't talk yet, and that's all you end up with. But by building that trust, you were able to get a lot more information about how the case was playing out and where its likely outcome may be headed. And this spans over now essentially 3 courts, because it started in Sebring Court as a civil case and then became criminal there. Then it became a criminal case in Mahoning County, and it's still a case in Mahoning County, but prosecutors switched in the process also. Gina DiGenova lost the election and Lynn Morrow came in. So the same court, but a completely different administration. So what were some of the updates they were giving us along the way? Obviously, without giving anything, confidential away.
Things that we were seeing were like, people who had earlier court rulings saying that they were owed money, and that some of the people were saying that they hadn't received payments, or they got payments initially, but they were either now sporadic or not happening anymore. So this was kind of like they were feeding us information saying, okay, we were hoping for a good faith effort here, and they were looking to forgive and move on with their lives. But that's when it became clear to them that there's more people still happening. There's more lawsuits coming. That's when they started reaching out, and the group started growing. They started getting calls from California and New York and Canada. So it was, a large area that this was happening from. And we spoke even with,
the American Kennel Club, wasn't it?
American Kennel Club, thank you. I was blanked on the name, but on whether she was, a registered breeder of the dogs, and she was. So, this woman did have some credibility with dog organizations. So,
and these kinds of cases do sometimes start with the best of intentions. I still think it's entirely possible that this is a woman with good intentions who got in over her head, but when you keep digging, there are consequences to that. Now, trust in news organizations is the most valuable currency that we have. And that is not just building trust with sources. That's part of the equation. but probably even a bigger part is building trust with the audience. At any time, and especially over the last, I'd say, decade and a half or so, maybe even a couple decades, there's a certain amount of vitriol directed at news outlets, largely by either partisans or people in power who don't like criticism, and they cast doubt on the credibility of certain organizations. So I'd like to use the discussion we've been on and pivot it to what are some things news organizations need to remember and be cognizant of in order to demonstrate to the audience that we really do work for you, as opposed to being on, the side of the authorities or the powerful.
I think, in talking about that, I mean, because things that we've seen and things that have changed over decades are, there used to be certain people, if they told you something, you trusted them. And I think that has eroded, where I think we have to question everyone, and that is part of our job, is to be fair, but question, and kind of balance this out, people lie, people exaggerate. We have to get through to the truth, because that's the only thing that matters to us, is the truth. I mean, that's what we chase.
And when you say people, are you talking like Walter Cronkite or the police chief?
No, I'm talking public officials.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm talking about anyone that's involved. Someone that calls in and has a story. Well, I have to make sure that they're credible. Because they're upset. Well, what's your complaint? Do you have proof of this? What can you show me to verify what you're saying is accurate? And then I can take it from there.
And sometimes that means that there are stories that actually go untold that may deserve to be told, but can't quite be vetted enough to be out there. That's a shame, but it is true when people call. You get this a lot with complaints about schools, I find. People will call and say, my kid went through such and such and no one did anything about it. And it's vague, and it very well may be that the kid went through something, but it cannot be quantified to a point where it can fairly be put out there. And you feel bad, but it has to be solid.
Right.
And that's one thing I think we emphasize so much, just in, journalism, is like, you give, if it's an official or something who's done something wrong, who has done something that's negatively impacted somebody, you reach out to them. We give them multiple chances. And you mentioned, April Waitman, just in that most recent case, like, you're reaching out to them. And a lot of times, it's, some people are of the mindset that if I don't say anything, they're not going to run the story, or if, and then you get that text after, or you get that comment where it's just like, oh, well, you hear a whole different story. They're telling people something different. Like, we gave you the chance to do something. We gave you the chance to come out and tell us your side. There's no, hiding from anybody in doing that. But, when you don't say something, when somebody's asking you a question, and it's not just us, like, other people have questions of these officials, and then you don't say anything. And now it's like, now the assumption is, okay, since you're not saying anything, now there must be something wrong there. And so I think that pressure there kind of, ultimately turns it, rears its ugly head too.
Absolutely, And on the flip side, what do you think are some mistakes that news organizations, they could be local, national, state, whatever, but what are some mistakes that they make that damages their credibility with the audience? And I'm not talking your egregious things. I'm not talking about, your deeply partisan outlets posing as legitimate outlets. I'm talking about otherwise legitimate outlets who simply are trying to do the best that they can, but you see these pitfalls.
I mean, one that we see, unfortunately, too often are typos. I mean, and and I know, with social media, everyone's the first to jump on and say, that we're stupid and we're, not doing our job. And obviously, no one wants to make a mistake, but it's one of those, like, when you're in the heat of the moment, you're answering phone calls, I'm talking with multiple people, we're juggling with reporters, and you're writing a story. Unfortunately, that is something that happens. Obviously, we don't want it to happen, but I've seen it from the broadcast networks down to, the big newspapers to us. We're human.
And there really are no small mistakes for that very reason. And, and even as we sit here saying this, I am aware, and we are all aware when we've done this, and we see the comments, and we're aware, and it's not excusable when it happens. And know that when we see, if we see a typo or a misspelling, and then all these comments on social media calling us out for it, know that one of us has noticed it probably before that and already come down on whoever did it.
Yep.
But what I don't think people understand, because you hear a lot of like, doesn't anybody proofread? And the answer is we're often proofreading ourselves.
Right.
We do proofread as best as we can, but the news organizations are slim.
And it's hard to proofread yourself. I can catch a typo that you make or you make. I miss my own because I know what it's supposed to say, you know.
Yeah.
And it's in my head. I see it. But it's not an excuse.
It's not an excuse. So we say this as more like laying our souls bare here, that these are not acceptable mistakes, but they can happen.
And I think every time any of us make a mistake, we take that pain home with us daily. It's like,
If we don't, we shouldn't be in this business.
For
sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think just like this weekend, we had a shooting in Wellsville, and it happened, late at night, and it's like you ultimately you're trying to get that, get the information out there to the people, because people in Wellsville are wondering what's happening right now. So you get that information out there, on top of being here, where it's like you got to get ready for a show. You're doing all these other things, and you're juggling a lot for sure. So I think it definitely, when you have something like this, like a podcast like this, you can kind of give people an idea of like just how much goes on. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about people who just they get scripts and they go up and they sit in front of the prompter and like it's a lot different than that.
A mistake that I see a lot, and I see it, quite frankly, I do see it locally, and I think it's made in good faith, but I think that it has a bad impact, or two things. One is what we would refer to as selling an empty box, where you hype something up, and then it really doesn't deliver. Or you might put out a headline that doesn't include a community name with the hope that you'll get people to click on it and see if it's their community, and negate the fact that if you've opened it and it's not yours or relevant to you enough times, you start to feel like you're being strung along. But a bigger one is, and I see this with, I think this has to do with a lot of group standards or higher ups that make standards instead of on the ground editorial decisions, is a certain reticence to name public officials when they're in trouble, or not just public officials, but specifically public officials, where the standard might be something like criminal charges being filed. And we're not going to name them until there's criminal charges filed, which makes sense on paper, right? Well, what if that public official has already been disciplined in their office? What if they've been placed on leave? Doesn't the taxpayer have a right to know who they're paying to stay at home while they're under investigation? And the problem with this, this is a little long-winded, but I'm going to have you guys react to it, is that if criminal charges are the standard, it's either an arbitrary standard, or you're sending the message that once the police and the prosecutor say you did it, then you must be guilty, even though you've still not been tried. If that's your standard, why wouldn't the standard be conviction? So it's an arbitrary standard because there's already been disciplinary action by a government entity below that by placing them on leave or by resigning or by invoking an investigation. So why would that be the layer of protection? And the reason that this hurts credibility, to my mind, is that it sends the message that we work for the authorities, that we work hand in glove. We don't work against the authorities, but they are among the people who our job is to hold accountable on behalf of you, the viewer, and you, the citizen. So when we inadvertently send that message that once the police say you did it, now we'll say it, because if they say you did it, we completely and implicitly trust them. We trust them when they build trust, but police are capable of making mistakes, and yes, they are capable of lying, just like prosecutors are, just like criminals are, just like defense attorneys are, just like anybody is. React to that. Talk about what you've seen, talk about what you think about that, anything.
I mean, I feel, I don't work for the authorities. I work for our community. And I think that's, what we do, and you do have a right to know. And if this is something that you need to be aware of, that's why we do this. I mean, that's, again, we follow the truth, and we get you the information you need to know. And I mean, when we get a call that says, you're one of the few people that do this, and that's why I've contacted you, that, makes us know that, I mean, just makes me emotional, like we are making a difference that counts,
Yeah.
When you hear people say, like, we even say it now, you never thought you would say this, 10 years ago, but like people turning to us, to get answers because they don't feel like they can get those answers somewhere else. And even in talking to officials, because I mean, you guys have been here for a long time. I've been here for a while too. It's like you talk to officials, and I think if the standard is always, we'll just, push whatever statement that it is, or we just won't take a comment from them, then it's just like, okay, well, if I can, if it dies because I don't say anything, then that becomes a precedent. But then, I mean, I know people who, again, they respect the fairness, they respect the integrity when it comes to that. They know, and then you see people who, like, when the pressure is put on them, it's like, okay, I'm gonna get out in front of this, as opposed to maybe being behind it.
Yeah.
And it's like you ultimately set the precedent based on how you report, everything that you do.
Yeah. I mean, and we've talked about this one before, the Jordan Brown case.
Yes.
I mean, again, normally we wouldn't name a minor, but in that case that happened, you're better with yours than me.
I'm going to say that was 2009, I
somewhere,
think.
I'd probably,
Maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's 16, 17 years ago, something like
but
that.
here was a kid that was named, but, ultimately because people were able to get records and do investigations and check into this,
Well, and that's true. I think anytime you name somebody is that there's this idea that you're protecting them by not naming them when they're accused until there's a criminal charge. Now, I've already talked about the problem with the criminal charge being the only standard and sometimes it's a perfect standard to use, but they have to be done case by case with editorial thought. But it's also that there's this sense that once you've named them, you've aggrieved them, you've done something wrong to them by naming them. There is a certain amount of obvious public embarrassment if your name's associated with an allegation, but you're going to face that allegation regardless. And if you are indeed to be exonerated, having your name out there does help call attention to your cause also. And in some extreme cases, if there really is, it's not a mistake, but actually an attempt to go after and target somebody, then that negative publicity that perceived negative publicity is helpful in your ability to fight back about how you were wronged by a powerful entity. Ultimately, we hold the powerful accountable. Doesn't mean we never trust them either. We've had powerful sources that we've trusted, but they have to earn the trust. We don't work for anybody but the audience. I can tell you how many times I've talked to public officials at every level, whether it be a school superintendent, a United States senator, I've written questions for presidents of the United States, whoever it might be, where we make it clear, listen, I work for the same people you work for. We owe them answers. If you're not going to give them, I'm going to have to report that we tried and you weren't willing to give those answers, but I'm not going to be derelict of duty, and I'm asking you not to be.
Yep. Exactly.
And it's, in a way, kind of, it's an unfair burden, to us in a way where it's just, if you're, that entity that's reporting on something and you've made numerous attempts to reach somebody, said, I've given you every floor available to come out and say something. And, when you say nothing, the assumption, there's, people are going to assume things. And also with the way social media is now, before somebody gets charged, people are already talking about it. I mean, you can go back to April Wademan, you could talk, like, people are talking about this, so they're putting pressure on you. So why isn't the news talking about this? And most times, they're linking an article that we put there. So, I mean, that's two different things, but no, it's the dynamic has changed, and with social media, it's just, for one, everything's out there. Two, people are talking about things, and it's like, if people are talking about it, people know that it's out there. And we're not, again, like you said, we're not accusing anybody of doing this, but we're just saying, like, here's what this person's being accused of.
Yes. They're
going through the court system, and I think that's something that's also, that's also misconstrued. We're not in the business of accusing people. We are putting what is out there, and that's.
Well, that's a good point, because if somebody is accused, let's just take a crime. Let's just to keep it as simple and black and white as possible, is if somebody's accused of a crime and they're indicted, they're charged in some court for this crime. Our story doesn't say so-and-so did this. Our story is not reporting on what they did. Our story is reporting on this powerful entity that is saying you did this. If that doesn't exist, or if we're too cozy with those authorities, the end result of that are powerful figures having impunity to pluck you off the street in secrecy. That cannot stand. When that does stand, and we've seen some examples at the national level of that happening recently, and it should send a chill down your spine, it is too much power consolidated into too many people, in too few people, and it's to the detriment of the citizen. Another example that I thought of when you were speaking, Corey, is with social media, is schools and threats or concerns for student safety. There are some superintendents who think that it behooves them to keep as much secret as possible and handle it internally. And that may have been a wise strategy 15 years ago. But now you allow the rumor mill on social media to run wild, and it is almost always worse than what the truth is. And we will dig for the truth. We had a story recently with a teacher who is under investigation, and they are on leave, and there is a story there. But the things we heard initially that got us looking into it were way worse than what we've been able to actually report on and find. So we're not hurting anybody when we name these people. We're actually providing a level of protection for everybody involved.
Yeah.
Final thoughts on any of this and why trust is so crucial in this and what the audience may not understand.
I mean, for us, I think having a trust in us and what we do is paramount for everything that we believe and do here. I mean, you have to, because we truly decide, what goes on the air. However, we have discussions of it. It's not one person here that makes any one decision. We have many levels that we go through and decide on everything here, and we have conversations. Even when reporters write the scripts, we all look at them and go through them and work out. So the trust factor is that it's not ever one person that just makes this call and it's a magic switch. They say we're doing this. It's a group effort that we go through.
And it's important to note that there are real journalists in the newsroom at this organization that make those decisions on a case-by-case basis. I say that because there are group-owned stations that have standards departments who make those decisions and hand them down. That's cookie cutter, and it does cause problems, and it creates some of what we've discussed today. We don't do that. No. And no real journalist does that.
Yeah, I think attention to detail and trust goes hand in hand too, because you're in a business where, we've been on how many breaking news stories over the years where people are hanging on every word that you're saying, and then that trust parlays into where you're doing stories, investigative pieces, right? Like words that you choosing your words carefully, being very cognizant of what you're saying, because that can have an impact on somebody. That can have that could really be a turning point in somebody's life. You never know, how far your story's going to go. It almost always comes back to this April Waitman case we're talking about, but just how a story like this, you have people from Florida coming in who are people who are impacted in Florida. Like your reach goes far beyond what you think, and you never know what those words are, ultimately the end result of those words.
Absolutely. So, the bottom line as we sign off on this month's edition of the Outcue is that what we do is all about building a relationship. It's all about trust. We work for you and on behalf of you. So we are going to fight on behalf of your trust, and we will work for your trust. And by all means, let us know. Let us know where we've fallen short. You've never been shy about that, and we actually do appreciate that. And let us know if somebody else that's in power seems to be taking advantage of something. We will look into that. We'll investigate it. We'll follow the facts where they lie. And that doesn't always mean there will be a story, but it means that we have to put in the work in order to develop that trust. And it's hard, and it's not work everybody is cut out for. But please understand that whether you like the news, whether you don't like the news, whether you like the way somebody looked in a story or didn't look in a story, our guiding light here is truth. And we will strive every day and fall short sometimes, but never intentionally, and we will always improve from the falling short, to get as close to objective truth as is humanly possible. Let the chips fall where they may. Until next time, this has been the Outcue.